John St. Julien wrote to me, and it is peculiar that he alternates in this comment between referring to himself in the third person and referring to himself in the first person. Quote, "This man built a charity from scratch that liberated thousands of children from child labor.
Please give me this sign and God will come back to me with a sign to let me know if this is the way I should go for something for the children or not. The reason I built this village for special needs children is because I had a dream about the concept. Didn't tell me exactly, but off the back of that dream I interpreted during that day afterwards what was meant from that dream from God."
And that is the simple truth of the mark of the beast. The seal of God inside your forehead is the activation of your pineal gland. You breach the 7 seals of Revelation, and there at the right hand of him was a book written inside, sealed up the back with 7 seals. You pass through them 7 energy centers. You raise the Christ within you. The mark of the beast on their forehead and on their hand. Those persons have shut down their connection to the seat of their soul, their pineal gland. And hand in mysticism means the hand of every beast and every man is symbolic of self-directed activities, of the desires and of the mental qualities. The beast is the expression of the flesh, consciousness via the flesh and the lower qualities of man. Those who have the seal of God inside their foreheads, the 144,000, are the same number. 1 plus 4 plus 4 plus 8 plus 15 is 9. It's a positive human consciousness.
This man built a charity from scratch that liberated thousands of children from child labor, built a village for disabled children, has a home for street-involved children, a rescue for hundreds of dogs, and employs hundreds of people. So I'll continue. Just a moment. Do you think the Pope can't say something similar? Do you think that at any point during the Dark Ages, do you think that in the middle of the genocide carried out against the indigenous people of Mexico, do you think the Catholic Church would lack a justification of this kind? Okay? Again, would you accept this excuse from a Muslim? Would you accept this excuse from a Catholic in the Dark Ages? Would you accept this excuse from the Communist Party? Sorry, how many thousands of children were liberated and raised as orphans by the Red Army in China? It's a very interesting history. No. There's no justification in this. On the contrary, it's urgent and critically important that people like myself and hopefully some of you people in the audience get motivated to scrutinize what charities do, their short-term and long-term impacts, despite this veil of sacredness that so many charities want to wrap themselves in. John St. Julien is the leader of a faith-based charity. You may say that he is, in his way, the leader of a faith, the leader of a new religion. He is someone who shares his religious views here on YouTube, and I was able to offer a very mild critique of the position he's now in just by juxtaposing some short clips of what his religious views are with his recent video lamenting the fact that some people refuse to donate money to support his charity, or they abruptly halt their donations to his charity because of his stated religious views. So he is aware, to whatever extent, that he is at least eccentric, or he is regarded warily by some of the people who would support his charity work, or some people who actually have supported his charity work in the past, but decided to stop when they found out what his faith-based convictions were. John saw my video criticizing him. He sent in a comment expressing his dissatisfaction. I'll read you that comment. And I'll read you the reply I sent to him by email. This need not be the end of the conversation. There are questions asked about John St. Julien in particular that I would love to get the answers to, and we may hear back from him any moment. I'm going to play you a short clip from a video on his channel. You may not understand immediately why it is I'm playing this clip in this context, but in a philosophical sense, the reason is this. Most of us live with a reassuring delusion that the Dark Ages were a brief and exceptional period in the development of life on Earth. We like to imagine that human beings have almost innately or biologically become more rational with the passage of time, and that we could never return to the attitudes that shaped the Dark Ages, not just in Europe, but obviously in India, in Asia, in the Muslim world. And of course, there's really no evidence for that, not even if we're just people who, as scholars, go back and read ancient texts, see the way people thought, the sentiments they had, and so on, as the centuries have gone by. Moreover, we just lived through, all of us, we just lived through this episode of the rise and fall of ISIS. And the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State, the Caliphate in the Muslim world, that was a very brazen, very direct attempt to return to the Dark Ages, to return to a specific iteration of and philosophy of Islam that can be completely accurately summarized as the Dark Ages in every sense of the term. The potential and even the propensity to return to a society based on pious ignorance, it is with all of us still. It's a part of human nature we have not overcome. And that's ultimately why, for myself, there's a pressing need to sound a dire warning when someone like John St. Julien is put in a position of power. Yes, over the lives of a certain number of children. When he's put in a position of power as an educator, if you like, without any of the controls that you'd have over a teacher, over an educator in a democratic society, without any of the qualifications, so far as I know. We'll come back to that later in the video. The broader and most profound question I want to raise here is going to be returned to in a sequel video, in a separate video from this one, is the question of, in the 21st century, how we can have a society where a huge, crucial part of the political landscape is taken up by rich people with no accountability to anyone but themselves, and charities with no accountability to anyone except their wealthy donors, where people can in effect make policy decisions with profound implications for orphans or poverty-stricken children, yes, but people make policy decisions that really have profound and important implications for the future of our society as a whole in a manner that has no public accountability, no public democratic process, where the only criterion, the only question of whether or not you're qualified is whether or not you have the money or whether or not you have the charisma to get rich people to part with their money to support you and your dreams.
Kundalini is the transfer of that energy. It's the electromagnetic energy which is constantly coursing throughout your body, which is represented as the 7 chakras or the 7 endocrine glands within your body, being the alchemical centers of this electromagnetic energy. It's a very straightforward scientific thing. For people who bother to shut up their minds, shut up their opinions, and actually read it. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm saying sex is bad. I am nearly 34. My wife is 10 years younger than me. She's very beautiful to me. I have a son with her. Of course, we express our love intimately. But what I will say is that Fritzi and I have a respectful rule with one another. And she and I, when we were trying for Aslan, my mental clarity dipped right off and I struggled a lot. And it was purely because I was exerting myself sexually more than I normally would. And they don't compute that as they get older, they have less ability to restore that energy expenditure when it comes to sex. They have less, it's a fact. And thus the amount of orgasms that they have in a month should reflect that. So I calculate for myself, I know for myself at the moment, I should have no more than 2 a month. That's where I'm at. Now I'm 33 and that's happening to me, but that's how I feel it in my mental health and in my productivity. No more than 2 a month. But for other men I've spoken to who are healthy, they're the same, actually. So I don't think line's really playing a big impact in it. But men who are conscious and understand these things that I've spoken to, they too feel that if they do any more than 2, sometimes 3 a month, they feel much less energy and productivity in themselves.
Does this seem harmless to you? Does this seem like a harmless, white, Christian eccentric who just happens to run a charity, raises poverty-stricken children in Africa? Would you perceive it as equally harmless if this man had brown skin, and wore a long white robe and was running a Muslim school. Check your own sense of Eurocentrism on this, people. What if this man were running a school, really any other religion, that was a little bit less familiar to you? It may seem harmless, but it's not. For my generation in Canada, the Canadian government really didn't want to know what was going on in faith-based schools controlled by mainstream religions like the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, Judaism. They really didn't want to know anything about it until the AIDS crisis hit. And I remember a radio talk show. People called in, talked to the radio, and one person called in and complained that at their Catholic school, the nuns instructed them to take a safety pin or a needle, and put holes in the condom before using it. This is, of course, instead of the nuns maybe honestly expressing what their own ethical reservations are about condoms. This is a time in Canada. This is 20th century, my lifetime. I'm not that old, when sex education being in the hands of religious authorities had to be challenged, had to be questioned. On the one hand, by the gay rights discourse, and on the other hand, the urgency of getting out the message of HIV, AIDS, etc. To some extent, concerns about teen pregnancy. And the government of Canada had to question, they were not really inclined to do so, separation of church and state, something that we in Canada do not have enshrined in our Constitution, and how it applies to this most difficult and thorny issue of, yes, schools, quote-unquote residential schools, the raising of orphans, so on and so forth. That has raised a series of questions that I think in most countries, not just Canada, we still have not answered to this day. Sure, John St. Julien is a dreamer. Dreams are dangerous. I'm certain that John St. Julien thinks that he's giving these children a scientific education. You've just had an indication of what he thinks of as science. You've just had an indication, and you'll see this throughout his videos, of how he is willing to take his own highly subjective experiences and project them out onto the world, not merely as objectively real, but as a standard for what's normal and as a standard for what ought to be. Now, as a separate question, I have discussed in other videos in the past, and I probably will discuss again. It's very interesting to me how frequently people take their own sexual dysfunction and then try to present it as a virtue, in this case as a kind of spiritual virtue or religious virtue. John St. Julien is here giving you sex advice, and he's a man who can barely manage to ejaculate twice a month without feeling enfeebled and so on. But he doesn't humbly sit here and tell you that this reflects some kind of health problem he has. Oh, no. He says that this is true and ought to be true for all men. He takes himself as a standard, as a norm, and he starts speaking about this prescriptively. And he starts speaking about it, if you hear the video as a whole, all his videos cover much the same issue. He starts speaking about it from the pulpit as a religious leader in his own right. It's dangerous. And I think the danger would be easier for everyone to perceive if simply he was wearing a Muslim's robes instead of a Christian's robes, right? And there are real questions of what qualifies someone to be a teacher, a caregiver, in a position of authority over children. In Canada, ultimately, someone had to make the decision, no, Catholic nuns can't teach sex education. Sex education requires some kind of formal credential in the sciences, some kind of background. We need people teaching real medical facts to children, teenagers, etc. We need to take this power away from the hands of the state. We can't treat faith itself as a kind of super credential that waves away all of those concerns. Right? John St. Julien wrote to me, and it is peculiar that he alternates in this comment between referring to himself in the third person and referring to himself in the first person. Quote, "This man built a charity from scratch that liberated thousands of children from child labor, built a village for disabled children, has a home for street-involved children, a rescue for hundreds of dogs, and employs hundreds of people." So I'll continue Just a moment. Okay. Do you think the Pope can't say something similar? Do you think that at any point during the Dark Ages, do you think that in the middle of the genocide carried out against the indigenous people of Mexico, do you think the Catholic Church would lack a justification of this kind? Okay? Again, would you accept this excuse from a Muslim? Would you accept this excuse from a Catholic in the Dark Ages? Would you accept this excuse from the Communist Party? Sorry, how many thousands of children were liberated and raised as orphans by the Red Army in China? It's a very interesting history. No. There's no justification in this. On the contrary, it's urgent and critically important that people like myself and hopefully some of you people in the audience get motivated to scrutinize what charities do, their short-term and long-term impacts, despite this veil of sacredness that so many charities want to wrap themselves in. Quote, my beliefs might not match your own, but to say I control children's lives is pathetic and maybe a little desperate, close quote. Okay, John, I grew up in a colony of the British Empire. Okay, it's called Canada. You know, I take it you're British. Googling around the internet, I was able to find very, very little about your background. We had something called the residential schools in Canada, and that was the way the church controlled the lives of our indigenous people, our Aboriginal people. There are many parallels to this history. In the Soviet Union, interestingly, very similar residential schools were set up to forcibly assimilate a lot of Russia's indigenous ethnic minorities, tribal peoples. And that was without belief in Christianity, obviously. That was belief in communism as a doctrine. Yes, you know, the authorities that shape a child's education, especially in a residential school or orphanage situation, yes, you have tremendous control over the lives of the children. What they eat, what they learn, what they read, what they do with their time, what kind of job training they get. Of course, it's a position of tremendous power and tremendous trust that's placed in your hands. And you've really discussed this yourself. On your own channel, I was able to quote you where people question your leadership because of your highly eccentric religious views, right? So he continues, where is your critique, or are you just advertising your own closed-mindedness here? You're disgusting. So there's a spelling error here with the word your. You're disgusting to try to put people off a charity with care workers who won Best Caregiver of the Year award, just as you're atheist. Again, the word your is misspelled, so is atheist. This level of elocution also makes me wonder, John, about your role as an educator. Weak man, our organization speaks for itself with every governing body there is. Good luck waking up and getting somewhere in life, brother. Okay, well, it's interesting you said that, John. I wrote back and said, hi, John. I saw your response to my video. I assume you didn't look into my own background in humanitarian work, research on humanitarian work, and humanitarian work in praxis before sending me this commentary. I assume also that you're unaware of my work as a scholar of religion. I have quite a robust background in both fields, although none of it transpired in Africa. I know that Buddhism is one of the religions you like to selectively quote from as some kind of spiritual authority. Let me tell you, I'm one of very few Europeans who, 1, actually learned Pali, the ancient scriptural language, 2, who conducted original research, and 3, who is willing to tell the truth about it. This is to say, dishonesty is more of a constraint on scholarship than raw ability in languages. Pause here for a second. Guys, education has to mean something, right? John St. Julien talks about Sanskrit texts. Did he ever learn to read Sanskrit? John St. Julien is carrying out a ministry to people in Tanzania. I really searched to find any evidence that John St. Julien had learned any African language, a Bantu language, Swahili. John St. Julien is apparently providing English language education in a country that made the decision to abolish English language education just recently in the year 2015. It was a really momentous political decision for Tanzania. They decided that really what they need for their future is to try to get a high level of proficiency and literacy in Swahili as the unifying language. John, why not? With any of these things, you present yourself as an expert on ancient sacred texts. You didn't learn Greek to read the Bible. You didn't learn Hebrew or Aramaic either, of course. You didn't learn Sanskrit. You didn't learn Pali. You didn't learn classical Chinese or anything else. And now here you are in Africa. You're not learning an African language like Swahili either. By all means, write back and correct me wrong. Again, you don't know my background. It's a direct contrast on all of these things. When I lived in Theravada, Southeast Asia, I learned the ancient scriptural language of the region. And then I also studied modern living languages in the countries where I was doing humanitarian work. Modern languages like Cambodian and Laotian. Today, my main language of scholarship is instead Chinese. What I learned about humanitarian work, even at the University of Toronto, was valuable. What I learned in Laos and Cambodia also was valuable. Just pause here. Guys, I took courses on this stuff. To give one example, look, again, the value of education has to mean something. I remember looking at a case study of a humanitarian project that went disastrously wrong. And you look at it step by step, how people with the best intentions just end up destroying this poverty-stricken village. And of course, a lot of the case studies were less dramatic than that. Even in the classroom in university in Toronto, I was learning things that are really valuable, containing really valuable warnings for someone in a position of authority like John St. Julien. John, I don't know if you have any training or education like that. I searched. I haven't found it. These are elements that would prepare someone in your position to be deserving of the trust, authority, and responsibility that has been placed in your hands. Of course, down-to-earth, scientific, secular attitudes would help. Knowing the local language, if you're going to be a religious authority, knowing the ancient language, actually being a scholar or having scholarly attitudes towards that language instead of just making things up off the top of your head based on your dreams and fasting and visionary experiences, that might reassure people too if some of your authority is going to be based on religion. But sure, as cynical as I may be about the state of modern Western academia, I think anyone can recognize that even the formal education I had in how the charity sector works, how nonprofits work, NGOs work, government-based intervention in humanitarian crises, that must be of some value greater than zero, precisely to someone in John St. Julien's position. So I continue here. I have not seen a CV of yours in terms of what scholarship, education, credentials, or background you might have. I have Googled looking for one. Please let me know if there's something available. Perhaps you have more of an education in religion, humanitarian work, education, etc. than I have assumed or imagined based on your YouTube videos. In my case, you'll find out a great deal about my background, both in humanitarian work and in Buddhist scholarship, from my YouTube videos. My channel has playlists for all the above, and I have a name that's easy to Google, Aizul Mazar. Who chose you, John? Who elected you? To whom are you accountable? The sad fact is that we live in a world where power has been placed in your hands by money alone. And the video I quoted of you showed you facing up to the one and only form of accountability you've got. And that is accountability to your donors. And you yourself have noticed your religious views are so eccentric, are so worrying, that some of your donors are standing up and saying, no more. It is not difficult for me to imagine the ideal resume for someone to do the job that you have appointed yourself to, John. And obviously, being fluent in Swahili would be on there. You think you know this too, right? Maybe Swahili and a couple other languages. I think you know the type of academic background that would help someone in your position. I think you know even what kind of scriptural background would make your claims about religion credible, or would at least provide you with the basis to start generating credible opinions about the history of religion. And you have none of that, John. What you have is the same thing I have. A YouTube channel where you ask for donations. And once you've got those donations, you don't answer to anyone at all except your dreams, your hallucinations, your conscience, and your idea of God. And that makes you every bit as dangerous as a crazy Muslim preacher, as a crazy Hindu preacher, as any other religious authority figure that your predominantly white Western Christian audience might be inclined to regard with a little bit more scrutiny, with a little bit more skepticism, before putting this kind of awesome responsibility in their hands. Responsibility for the lives of a certain number of children, yes, but power that will in some ways shape the future of Tanzania, sure, that'll have knock-on effects none of us can fully realize. Just as in the history of Canada, putting so much power in the hands of the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church in our history of education, it had knock-on effects that we're all still dealing with to this day.